Hello everyone, welcome back. You're watching Avorion episode 13. I'm Enigmius, and today we're continuing with the Melapes build. I didn't mention the name in the last episode. I realized it was the first episode of a new build and I didn't mention the name. It's portmanteau, if you want to look that up, of the Latin equivalent of honeybee, which is kind of silly when you think about it because there's no honey in space, but you never know. And this is kind of a working ship. The purpose is to have something within which to scoot around and gather resources and defend ourselves from encroaching pirates and aliens. So that's how we arrive at the name. Essentially, what I'm working on in this episode is just the outriggers and nacelles for some engines. That's kind of the idea with this ship. I did a little bit of accidental testing with it once I had finished all the building for this episode, and it was basically impossible to determine the performance of the ship without a mechanic and an engineer on board. I think engineer is the most important for that thing. So you get the idea. In terms of what this ship will be able to do with maneuverability and speed, I'm probably at some point before the build is done going to maneuver it towards a shipyard so that I can hire crew and get them on board and make some real-time decisions about the performance of the ship before it's deemed to be complete. So there are some cosmetic concerns, and by concerns I mean things that worth considering about how I would like this particular part of the ship to look. And then, of course, it's the functional element. If we're building something that's supposedly going to be the home for engines and thrusters, then we want to give a little bit of consideration, or at least a little bit of consideration for that as well. And for me, that means making sure that it's large enough, first of all, to hold a meaningful amount of these things. Whatever it is we want to put in there, is it large enough that it justifies having this extra structure to hold these things, or are we going to go puny and end up with something that we'd be better off without? Lighter ship by moving things towards the middle would be one option, unless we actually make it worthwhile to have it with the engines and the thrusters and these sort of outboard structural elements. Additionally, there's a certain amount of thought that has to go into the protection of these ship assets. Engines and thrusters being kind of important in a fight for getting out of the way of things that are dangerous, closing the gap on things that we need to close the gap on, running away if we have to. That's definitely something that we can consider as a part of the whole process, a part of the whole function of these things that we're attaching to the ship. So once we get this sort of structural element taken care of, which it took a little while, but I'm pretty happy with the way it turned out. We got a reasonable transition from the central part of the ship to the basically 90-degree outrigger, and then we can attach pretty much whatever we want. And we're keeping that theme of having an armored block skeleton for the ship. So everything is essentially held together by blocks of armor with iron hull blocks around it. So in terms of defending the stuff, the equipment that we put in this part of the ship, again, I'm a little bit leery of just going all armored blocks because of the mass, the weight, and kind of thinking to myself, how much space do we need to get the same amount of protective value out of iron relative to the mass that we would get out of by having to add that much more iron? I think the way it boils down, and I'm going to have to double check this, so don't take my word for it, that if you were to do all of the math, it would probably work out to be more defense per mass, per unit of mass for having the armor blocks than the iron, and thus the reason for having them at all, but also the option, if you wanted to just build big and bulky with the iron and kind of get the same sort of effect. The key consideration, aside from how much protection you get relative to how it looks based on the size that you have to occupy, is, of course, the impact that it has on the performance of the ship. So I think I'm going to put this in my mental notebook. Before the next episode, I'm going to sit down and do a little bit of mathematications to determine whether or not it's prudent to pass off some of the defensive capability to regular iron blocks versus armor. And, you know, come to a general consensus in my own mind of when it makes sense to use one over the other. I guess that would be a roundabout way of saying I have no idea at this particular point in time how to make the best out of each relative to one another. So I'll spend a little bit of time and I'll look at that and the actual numeric values of everything in the protective health quantities per unit of measure, etc., and come up with hopefully something that's meaningful and useful as we move forward with this build and others and making decisions about what kind of materials that we're going to use. So you can see now we've got the main part of the ship, the main hull. The outrigger is basically done for all practical intents and purposes, and now we're doing the nacelle sort of structure. This is where I had a very loose idea in my head of precisely what it was that I wanted to build in terms of the shape of this whole thing. But again, the key considerations being that it was large enough that we could include a meaningful amount of whatever equipment we decided to put in place, and that it would be able to afford a certain amount of protection so that it doesn't get destroyed. So in addition to the overall amount of health that we're providing around this equipment, there's also a certain amount of thought to where is that armor located relative to the equipment, and based on, you know, just imagining various different positions where you could be receiving incoming fire from, which sort of orientation is the most advantageous for protecting this equipment, and how can we influence that by some of the decisions that we make in the design process. And so that was sort of a key element that I was looking at when I was filling things in. You can see we just put in a few engines, which I wasn't really happy with that for sort of rectangular look. So at some point we're going to switch that around. It might not necessarily be immediately, but it'll happen. We're going to change it around so that to me it looks a little bit more interesting. You see we're already removing them and sort of figuring out how we're going to lay out the replacement. And I liked the idea of having them stacked in sort of layers like this. I can't say specifically why. It's 100% subjective, just kind of looking at it and making the decision which I like better. So we've got the engines that are giving us thrust, forward momentum, so to speak, and then we've also got the thrusters that we can use for maneuvering and braking. That's kind of the whole idea here. And again, you can see all that space that we have inside. For the time being, maybe until I look at the materials cost, it makes sense to me to just fill that up and you know, have it as substantial as it makes sense to have at this particular point in time. And now we have this outside edge of the nacelle, and we can sort of maintain the profile that we've already got and just kind of wrap it around and call it a day. But I decided that it would make more sense to me to have this a little bit beefier, again built out of the iron blocks this time around. Maybe that will change depending on our findings when we sit down with the wiki and the numbers, but for the time being I decided to have a larger structure, wider and you know, taller, I guess. Basically a larger profile than the one that we've already been using in order to create this nacelle kind of thing. And this means that if we're being attacked from the side, it's going to be much more difficult to actually hit the engines or the thrusters before they have to work their way through the hull blocks that we put in place. So there's the defensive element comes from, in this case, the size of the panel that we're adding to the outside edge of this nacelle in order to protect the interior, and hopefully that will lead to a little bit more survivability in terms of the mobility, and not having our critical elements blown off the ship in the first 15 seconds of combat. In addition to the fact that we're going to have redundancy, we're going to have things spread out, we're going to have various different locations where there will be engines and thrusters I'm hoping that that will all kind of contribute to a more robust design. But additionally, and something that you don't necessarily see in this episode, that we'll be working on the next episode, is I do plan on adding armored panels in strategic locations around other parts of the nacelle. The idea is that we can probably come up with a cosmetic sort of arrangement that looks kind of interesting, but also adds that extra layer of protection and makes it that much harder for enemies to fire directly upon these critical ship systems based on the direction that we're facing and where the enemy is. All of these things coming together in sort of this success or failure outcome. This is what I like about the design process. Aside from just coming up with shapes in my head and building them in the game, is kind of trying to give a little bit of consideration to how things will play out in certain situations. And if we can strategize to a certain extent in the design of the ship to improve longevity, while at the same time not sacrificing the enjoyment that we get out of, you know, building certain shapes. There's got to be a little bit of both in order for me to be truly happy with what I'm doing. But you get the idea now from the shape. It's not particularly complicated, but I like the look of it. It's got some interesting angles. And then we've got this sort of flat section that I decided I needed another one of my vents just because I like them. And barring all else, they're a pretty well, there's a fairly straightforward way to add a little bit of detail and a little bit of interest to something that would otherwise be kind of flat and dull, like the outside edge of this panel that we put over the engines and such. So right now I'm just kind of putting the backer blocks so that it's easier to place the sloped blocks in order to create kind of a gentle curve, and then once those are in place, we can join them together with flatter panels and then put the sort of partitions in the back end, and voila, we've got a fairly ubiquitous at this point, but I think interesting element that just kind of fits on the side. And then we can sort of dress it up a little bit here and there by adding maybe, for example, some angled blocks on the top and bottom faces of this vent. You can see they're kind of flat and dull by themselves, so we can add a little bit there. We can do a little bit with this back end just to make it a little bit more interesting than just a 90-degree fall off the way it originally came out. All things being equal, I like the way this build is headed. I'm having a lot of fun with it, and as opposed to the previous build where we basically just built it all and then tested it after the fact, like I say, we're going to get it to a shipyard so that we can get some crew hired, get them on board, and be able to test all of the key details as we go and get a feel for how it's going to turn and move and accelerate and boost and all that other stuff. So next episode, we're going to carry on from where we left off. I've given you a couple of ideas of things that we'll be working on. If you want to be notified about that episode, the easiest way to do that is to subscribe to my channel or follow me on social media. Links for social media are always in the information section below the video. Feel free to leave your comments and feedback. Thanks for watching, guys, and take care.